Now that you've been watching the moon for a few weeks, it's time to add a few more parts to the project. In this video, you're going to learn how to name the moon phases and also how to create your graphs of moonrise and moonset. Let's start with the phase names. Many of you are probably familiar with the full moon name and maybe even the crescent moon, but there are other phases as well, and I want to make sure that you can name all of them correctly. I'm going to show them to you in order as they occur throughout a lunar cycle. We start with a crescent. We then move on to a moon that looks half illuminated. It's not called a half moon though, it's called a quarter moon, and that's because it's a quarter of the way through its lunar cycle. We then have a phase that's not quite full, but more than a quarter, and that's called a gibbous. Eventually we get to the full moon. Notice that as we go back down towards new again, the dark side, which in this case was on the left, is now going to be on the right. For example, here's the gibbous phase after the full moon, and the dark portion is to the right, whereas here it was to the left. Now we have another quarter moon, and again, notice that it's the mirror image of the one that happened before the full moon. Then we get to our crescent phase, and then we get to a new moon phase, which you can't see because you'd be looking directly towards the sun. So I've drawn it here with some dashes to indicate that it's there, but we really can't see it. But we're not done yet. There's a little bit more to the naming process. When the moon is going from its new phase, which was before this crescent, to the full, it's called waxing. And when it's going from full back to new, it's called waning. So the moon waxes and it wanes. And this is part of the actual way we name the moon phases. So let's go back and name these correctly. Waxing crescent. That implies not only that it's a crescent, but that it's on its way to become full. Then we have the first quarter moon. And again, this is a quarter because it's a quarter of a way through the entire set of phases. We then have a waxing gibbous, and then full. And technically, this would be your second quarter moon, but we don't call it that. We then go to a waning gibbous, and please notice that waning is spelled with one N in the middle, not two. We then have our third quarter moon, or sometimes it's called the last quarter moon, a waning crescent, and the new moon. So these are the names that you should use for your phases. All of the observations you've made up until today, you can go back now and give the proper name. And as you continue on, you can give these names. Notice that some of these are sort of instantaneous. Maybe you'll see it for one day, and that would be the quarters and the full. Whereas other ones might last for about a week. The crescent, you'll notice, might get larger and larger and larger until it's finally a first quarter. So there might be several days of a waxing crescent, several days of a waxing gibbous, but only maybe one day of a first quarter and one day of a full. Now we're going to move on to moonrise and moonset and how to graph this. Here's a little picture out of the newspaper. And you might not get the newspaper, or you might. You might be aware that sunrise and sunset are always listed in the newspaper. What you probably never paid attention to is that moonrise and moonset are also listed in the newspaper. Remember that both of these events are related to Earth's spin, not because they're moving across the sky. Well, that's not exactly true. The moon does orbit Earth. We'll get to that later on. I don't expect you to check the newspaper every day. There are places on the internet where you can find a whole month or even a whole year of moonrise and moonset data. Here's one site that I suggest you can go to. When you get there, you have to enter the city and the month that you're interested in. And so since we're spanning 2 months, you're going to probably have to do this over 2 months. And then you're going to get a chart that looks something like this. We have the date, the phase of the moon, the time it rises, the time it sets, the visible moon surface, and the distance to Earth. We're only concerned about these columns right here. So the first thing you might notice is that some of these numbers, which are supposed to be times, are larger than 12. And that's because this is using military time. 0 to 12 is AM time. So 8:20 is 8:20 AM. And then after the 12, military time goes on to 13 hours, which is 1 o'clock, 1400 hours, which is 2 o'clock, etc., all the way up to midnight, which once again goes back to 0. This number down here, 2355, means 5 minutes to midnight, 11:55 p.m. So you'll have to make sure you get comfortable using military time. It's just an easier way than using AM and PM. If you look carefully at this column, you'll see that for October 1st through 9th, the moon set and then later on it rose during any given day. After the 11th, the moon rose before it set on any given day. And on the 10th, it never rose, it only set. Now how can that be? Well, that's because on this day, the 9th, it rose just a few minutes before midnight. And then on the 11th, it rose just a few minutes after midnight of the 10th. So these are still about 24 hours apart, but they don't happen to fall on the 10th. So when it comes to plotting these data, if there's no rise time, then don't plot anything on the 10th. So what are you going to do? First of all, please use graph paper. Do not do this on notebook paper or blank paper, computer paper. Please use graph paper and a ruler. Make it neat. First, you're going to make a line along the bottom, and I suggest you make your paper in the landscape orientation that I've shown here. And we're going to put date along the bottom. Then on the y-axis, we're going to put time. So for date, you want to fit in all of the days that we have been observing. And I would suggest, if you have graph paper about this size, that every line represents a day. And so you need to label some of these. I've labeled every 4 here just to give your eye somewhere to go. You don't have to label every single one. But you do need to put the dates on the ones that you have tick marks for. So let's say we're going to start on October 1st, which actually is not really our start date. So this is October 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, etc. And you can label all of those. For the time axis, it's a little more tricky because how do you put time on a linear graph if time is a cycle? Well, I suggest that every one of these lines represents an hour. And so I've got my first line here at the bottom, and then I've gone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I'm going to put 4 different increments of 6 on my timeline, so I have a total of 24 lines or 24 hours. I suggest making midnight at the bottom. 6 hours later will be 6 a.m. 6 hours later will be noon. 6 hours later will be 6 p.m. or 1800 hours in military time. And then we are back to midnight up here. So that's the way you want to set up your graph. Finally, you also want to have a title. I like to see interesting titles instead of just moonrise graph. That's kind of boring. It's up to you, but make sure you have some sort of title that describes what this graph is. So that's your setup. Now what? So here's my graph, here's my wonderful title. Now I go back to that data table, and I'm going to plot points. So this one is going to show the rising of the moon. You can either make 2 graphs, one with moonrise and one with moonset, or you can make 1 graph showing both, which is what I'm going to show you here. So let's start. On October 1st, the moon rose at 18:58, which is roughly 1900 hours, which is 7 o'clock p.m. So here's the first, and there's 7 p.m., so I'm going to make a dot. On the 2nd of October, it rose at about 1924, which is about 7:30. So on the line that represents October 2nd, I'm going to put a point. October 3rd, this is about 10 minutes to 8 p.m. October 4th, 8:20 p.m., etc. And so that's what you're going to do. You're going to plot the points. On this particular plot, I'm going to add setting as well. So now we're going to use the setting column. On October 1st, the moon set at 6:30 a.m. So there's my data point. On the 2nd, it set at 7:24. On the 3rd, it set at 8:20. These are all a.m., etc. So I think you get the idea. Now, if you're going to put them on the same graph, you have to have some sort of key. Either you need a different color, or you could have a different symbol. You could have stars and circles or triangles, just as long as it's clear to me which one is set and which one is rise. A few more things. If you notice the trend here in the rise, you can imagine that eventually it's going to hit this midnight hour. Well, then what do? Do you go up here? Because up here, where it's 1, 2, 3 in the morning, is the same as down here where it's 1, 2, 3 in the morning. Once you pass midnight, you're going to jump down here and continue your data points in this fashion. This is going to happen with the set as well. As you get to that midnight hour on your graph, you're going to drop down and then continue down here so that you can fit everything on your graph neatly. Now, there's another great advantage to having this graph for the rest of your viewing. All the areas I've shaded in purple are the times when the moon is visible, including these two little areas here. So let's look at this date right here, whatever it is. So the moon rises around, it looks maybe 5 a.m., and then the moon is visible until about 6 p.m. or 7 p.m., and then it sets. So on this particular date, you would not be able to see the moon at 9 at night or 10 at night. So if you're out there looking for the moon and you check and you have your graph done, you can say, oh, well, I shouldn't even be looking because the moon is not up. You can see sometimes when the moon's going to be up early in the morning, other times when it's going to be up in the afternoon, and then times when it's not going to be available. So that's another thing that's handy about this graph. So I think you're all set now for your moonrise and moonset graphs, as well as naming your moon phases. The last video that I'll show you when it comes to the moon will be how to put together your 3rd grade lesson plan. Good luck and happy viewing!